Live from beyond the Beltway, this is Chris Roebling sitting in for vacationing Bruce DuMont. This is our weekly analysis of national politics, and we're featuring our guests Charles Lipson, retired chairman of the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago, and Eitan Mikaeli, author of the newly published and very well-received 12 Tribes, Promise and Peril in the New Israel. Of course, this conversation, weekly for many years now, features occasional injections of rumor and innuendo, all offered up by our panel of political insiders, pundits, power brokers, public servants, professors, and most importantly, plain-speaking Americans from coast to coast. Our program tonight is coming to you from our home base at 560 The Answer WIND Radio in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, and our phone lines are open at 1-800-723-8289. I welcome Eitan Mikaeli and Charles Lipson. Hello, gentlemen. Thank you for joining, and Happy New Year. How are you?
Happy New Year. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to be here too. And I want to add for listeners that Eitan and Chris and I all know each other. We all like each other, and it hasn't prevented us from disagreeing in I hope, pleasant ways, but without pulling punches.
Pulling punches is not what this program is about. We learned that years ago from Bruce DuMont, who's taking a well-deserved evening off. And I don't want either of you to pull punches, but at the same time, I hope that tonight, the sort of 2nd of January, a little bit of a look back, a little bit of a look forward. I'd like a little more forward than back. I'd like us to talk about the possibility, the areas, maybe the potential ground for some kind of conciliation, if not reconciliation. Just a little bit of conciliation might go a long way. And perhaps there's some sort of center out there. I just don't know. I'm not saying there is. But that's why we've got smart people like you two to come in and talk about it. So let's say that tonight I want to go through specific areas, and I want to hear from you what you think possibilities are and what the salient issues are, and then possible solution, or your sense of, is there any common ground out there? Okay, that's what I'd like to do for us, and invite the listeners to join in the conversation, submit topics. I'm not as friendly as Bruce. I don't leave listeners on as long. I like them to say what they came to say and then go away. And we got Fritz Goldman, our friend, in
That's
the
what
control
I
room.
feel about you, Chris.
Fritz is in the control
That's what I
room.
think about you.
He knows how to trapdoor those guests very, very well. So, start off. Let's talk about education. Let's talk about K-12 education. Both of you are big advocates for education. Obviously, Charles, you've devoted your life to it, and Eitan, you're out teaching people, especially sort of graduate students in journalism all the time, and you have greater prominence from your two very successful books now. We saw K-12 education become what may have been the deciding issue in Virginia. Charles, why did it become the deciding issue? And are there problems that everybody can agree on? And therefore, are there solutions folks can agree on to those problems?
I think that it's important to begin with two background elements to all political discussions. The first is that we've been in a lockdown or constricted mode, in effect under house arrest, for so long, people are just grumpy. And I would say that our politics has been, with the possible exception of the two Obama elections, for several decades now, all about throwing the bums out. It's all been negative. Our politics has all been negative. Get rid of the guys who are already there. They've disappointed us. I think the second background issue is that we're in the midst of a technological industrial revolution at least as important as the one that happened in the early 1800s and the one that formed Chicago around 1900, right? That was a big, heavy industry revolution. It brought in people from Poland and everywhere else. And a lot of the jokes that were made, for example, the ethnic jokes that were made about different groups, were because those groups didn't need to be educated and the city didn't educate them because the jobs required lifting heavy things and so forth. It didn't require cognitive abilities. But the economy we're in now requires cognitive ability of a very high level. And I think that it's impossible to talk about education without talking about the failure of our institution, not just K-12, but a lot of the uh, colleges and universities in failing to educate students for this new environment. Of course, what happened in Virginia added to that because um, the the teachers unions, which led a lot of the shutdown of public schools, private schools remained open. Those people decided that they were really ultimately responsible for kids' education, and that parents should have almost no role in it. And it was a terrible misstep by the Democratic gubernatorial nominee Terry McAuliffe to endorse the teacher's position on that, which opened up the road for Glenn Youngkin.
And let's hear from Eitan here before the end of the segment.
Sure. So my first book, which I'll pull a copy out here. Well, I'll do that in a minute when I don't knock things over.
It's in better airports everywhere, isn't it?
It is. It's called The Defender: How the Legendary Black Newspaper Changed America, and it's a history of the Chicago Defender newspaper. If you don't know what the Defender is and what it was founded in 1905 in Chicago. Really at the cusp of that industrial revolution, when industrial newspaper technology suddenly became available to the common man. And Robert Abbott, an African-American migrant from Georgia, who was trained at the Hampton Institute, then as now one of the finest African-American institutions of higher learning. He came to Chicago, took advantage of that technology with very little resources. The legend is as little as a quarter. He was able to build the newspaper into the first national communications vehicle for African Americans and made it a political force unlike any other. The Defender was responsible for the migration of African Americans that became known as the Great Migration. It was a newspaper that helped foster the political migration of African Americans from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and beyond. It was a newspaper that played an essential role in the civil rights era and beyond. And it was a newspaper that kind of became a conservative voice or a moderate voice, or was seen as such in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, as other kinds of voices became more vocal in the.
Oh, hello. You know, these days, I'm often quoted as saying, you can't believe everything you read on the internet. People forget that I was the first technology president, using the telegraph, T-mails as I like to call them, to communicate with my generals. Well, today, we are fighting a cybersecurity war, and our best defense is for folks to follow some of these tips when they're online. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Hover your cursor over links to determine the true web address. Look for misspellings and poor grammar, which are warning signs of fraud. Be suspicious of emails requesting urgent action, and never give away sensitive personal information. With malware for none, with cyber protection for all. This is your humble servant, Abraham Lincoln.
Type 2 diabetes can have a big impact on your life, but how can it be prevented? Well, the first step is knowing if you have prediabetes, a serious medical condition that puts you at high risk for type 2 diabetes. 1 in 3 American adults has prediabetes, but more than 80% don't know they have it. The good news is, prediabetes can be reversed, and for many people, healthy changes in their daily routine can make a big difference. Take the 1-minute risk test today at doihaveprediabetes.org.
Sitting in for Bruce DuMont, my name is Chris Roebling. Great to be with you here on the second day of 2022. Eitan Mikhaili was answering a question about education. We got into a little bit of the history of the Defender. And Eitan, thank you. We've all got to keep an eye on the clock here, but let's square that circle with how it all relates back to K-12 and whether or not this is an issue on which anybody can find common ground in today's environment.
Well, so what I was saying was that the book that I wrote on the history of the Chicago Defender, you could say is one that is the kind of alternative history of the United States that a lot of people are feeling challenged by these days. In my case, it was a work of nonfiction. I'm not this wasn't something that was for K through 12 consumption necessarily, and it wasn't it's not as far as I know being included in K through 12 curricula, but it is being taught at the college level and at the graduate school level, and I think it's important to do the kind of critical historical work that has sometimes gotten a bad rap. To do it at the graduate and the college level. I think a lot of parents got upset because they felt that that the kind of history that they were being taught was not appropriate for their kids. You can characterize it a lot of different ways, and I think a lot of political gain was made by characterizing it this way or that way. But the reality is that the kind of history history is a process of rediscovering old information and presenting it in new ways. The process of history is going to be contested, and it's going to be difficult, and it's going to frankly involve steps forward and steps back. And
Eitan, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
When do you think it becomes ideology?
When do I think it becomes ideology?
Yeah, when do you think that? I think is what is the crux of a lot of the debate. A lot of families, conservative families in particular, feel that their kids are being indoctrinated, that they're facing an ideological onslaught. They're perfectly willing, I think, or they should be willing, to have history taught warts and all. But at some point, it becomes an ideology. And I'll give you one example.
Yeah.
I heard this week from a very reputable source that one of the top private schools in Chicago is now, for its interviews with parents who want to send their children to school, yes, demanding that the parents agree to the school's equity, inclusion, and diversity agenda, which is an ideological approach that they have to this. That is, it's a departure from America's traditional notion that everybody should be treated equally and race shouldn't be taken into account and so forth. You can agree with that or not, but they're now making that a litmus test. And I think that that's true in a lot of classes. I don't think you could major in a lot of subjects in most schools and disagree with the teachers.
Now, that's at one of the prestigious private schools in the city that you mentioned, right?
It's a
That's
national
correct.
program, but
let me give you an
yes, we all know
example
which school we're
from
talking
my
about.
son's not so prestigious public school in Chicago, it's an excellent school. He's gotten a great education, but in that school, I made a presentation to the students there about the Defender, about my book. Again, it's just a nonfiction book that is done well there. And I brought slides, pictures from the early part of the 20th century of the founder of the Defender, again, a guy named Robert Abbott, a migrant from the African-American migrant from the South, who became one of the first African-American millionaires by building the Defender up as a newspaper. And the photos, I couldn't help but see the impact that those photos had on the African-American students in the class in particular. And they came up to me afterwards, and I could tell from speaking with them, and I asked them, and they confirmed it, that they haven't seen these kind of photos included in a curriculum previously.
But
this is at a school where there's certainly no end of goodwill to teach this. There's no a shortage of effort in a city that has resources, in a school that has resources.
Eitan, let me just say,
Yeah.
It sounds to me like you're making an appeal for comprehensive curriculum, and I don't think anybody's against comprehensive curriculum. I think
I'm saying that anecdotes, take us one way. We can find anecdotes of overreaches in a lot of direction, and we can find anecdotes of weakness in kind of silliness in Charles's case. If you want to really drill down, I mean, I don't know how else to characterize it. Right? This is a situation in which we've got a lot of work to do on the American education system. I think that the parents,
what are you saying is silly?
Charles is absolutely right when he says that parents' voices are being squelched in the debate. There's no doubt for me about that, speaking as a parent.
Okay, but what are you saying is silly? Is it silly for the school to be interviewing parents, and just so that people around the country know, there's a further allegation that the school is very selective about the parents to whom it puts these questions, that they are of one religious background.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
What's the who are they selecting for scrutiny?
Well, according to the report that I read, which is, I don't have it's an internet news platform, that this is being done only with Jewish parents. But the question remains, at some point, Eitan, comprehensiveness is not ideology. Comprehensiveness is the opposite of ideology. It's actually allowing the subject matter to speak to the children, to the student, to the parents for itself. Where is the line between ideology and, say, straight, comprehensive historical teaching?
It's a really difficult question, and Charles has a lot more experience than I do as an educator, and knows much better than I do that different levels of young people have different levels of capacity to absorb and process different kinds of information. Let's take one that I think has become politicized in really a strange way. Christopher Columbus, right? He's been adopted as an Italian figure, although his ancestry, according to more recent research, is probably Basque or somewhere in the Iberian subcontinent for sure. But he's been adopted as a kind of symbol of Italian Americanness, and so he's being defended by Italian Americans in that respect. But if you read Christopher Columbus's actual journals, which I encourage anyone to do, I mean, they're available online and everywhere else, he doesn't come across as a particularly sympathetic or admirable figure, a moral exemplar, or as someone that you would want your kids to emulate. He doesn't even come across as particularly intelligent. He comes across as someone who's seeking gold and willing to do basically whatever it takes to get a hold of that gold. That's not to say that his accomplishments don't need to be celebrated. It's not to say that his role in history doesn't need to be discussed or acknowledged. It's just that as you progress in your historical understanding of things, you have to understand all of those levels.
Okay.
You have to, on the one hand, if you're talking
to
children, say, this is what he did.
Okay.
And as you're talking to adults, explain he was this kind of person.
All right.
We're able to understand these things, but not necessarily all at once.
All right. So, Charles, we've got about a minute or so. Your view of Eitan's...
Eitan, you ignorant slut. The reason we celebrate Christopher Columbus has nothing to do with the person of Christopher Columbus. What we're really celebrating is the connection of the New World to the Old World and becoming part of a kind of Western civilization. And the reason that places like Berkeley, California, and so forth don't celebrate it, and for several years have only celebrated, if that's the word, Indigenous Peoples Day, is because all they see out of this connection is the oppression of Indigenous people. Well, both things are true, right? There was an exchange of these two cultures, but it's important to understand there are no more heroes in America. They're all cut down at the knees or higher. And Christopher Columbus is just caught in that crossfire.
Well, I'm saying that there's no reason to tell 6-year-olds that. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to say there are no heroes to first graders. And
name a hero for a first grader.
Well, they have sports heroes. They have, you can look. I'm saying that there's no reason to present Christopher Columbus's complexities to someone.
Oh, I agree with it. I agree with that.
Yeah,
I agree with that. We should be teaching them string theory instead.
All right.
Look, there's a way to. What I'm saying is also we were talking before the show of graduate students, right?
Yeah, and that's different. Of course, that's different.
That's right.
Guys, I got to go.
Today,
I got to go.
Graduate students need to be...
Here we go. Hold on one second. Our phone line is 1-800-723-8289. 1-800-723-8289. We got a couple of good calls waiting, and we'll be back after these words with Charles Lipson. And
along the way is where we find the unexpected. Along the way is where we take in the scenery, and often where we have the most fun. Sure, along the way can be the place we stop to fill up or grab a bite to eat. But in Michigan, along the way becomes the place we've been longing for. Because enjoying the journey is always pure Michigan. Your trip begins at Michigan.org.
The central and midwestern U.S. averages more than 850 tornadoes each year, and lately, the number of floods has been rising in the region too. So chances are, there will be more twisters and floods near here again. And between school, sports, and social lives, chances are, you won't be with your kids when it happens. Will they know what to do? Ready.gov/kids has all the educational tools and information to make the conversation easy. When the time comes, chances are they'll feel prepared, not scared. So talk with your family today.
Sunday evening means Beyond the Beltway with Bruce DuMont. This evening you're getting Chris Roebling. I'm sitting in for Bruce this week, and he'll be back soon. Guests are Charles Lipson, former chairman of the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Eitan Michaeli, noted author with a new book out we'll get to in just one moment. This is the part of the program where guests introduce themselves. Charles, give us a few points about yourself.
I'm originally from the Mississippi Delta, precisely the place that Eitan has written about that was reached by the Chicago Defender, and so many of the African Americans who live in Chicago came north from those cotton fields and so forth. I didn't take quite that route. I grew up in a small town in Mississippi, went east to college and got a PhD, and then came to the University of Chicago to teach, taught international relations and other subjects for many years, and in recent years have mostly been writing. I'm an emeritus professor, mostly been writing both academically, but especially now a lot of opinion pieces on American politics.
Eitan Michaeli, your new book is called 12 Tribes, Promise and Peril in the New Israel. And there we've got a picture of it right up there, looking really good. Eitan, tell us about yourself and the new title.
Well, thank you for putting that up there. I also came to Chicago really through the University of Chicago. I was a student an undergraduate student there after growing up in Rochester, New York. And I worked after graduating from the University of Chicago, I decided that I wanted to be a novelist. Found out very quickly that the jobs for aspiring novelists were pretty few and far between, and instead was very lucky to get a job as a journalist at the Chicago Defender, which I didn't even know until I walked through the doors was a historic African-American owned newspaper. It took me many years, took me another 19 years after I started working there to write this book, The Defender, How the Legendary Black Newspaper Changed America. And that book did well. The New York Times called it a towering achievement not soon to be forgotten. Which I don't have any tattoos, but I seriously considered getting that just to convince myself that it was real. And that book gave me the ability to do a second book. This one is also personal in a way, 12 Tribes, Promise and Peril in the New Israel. It is me, not too much of my personal background, but it's me talking about Israel at the grassroots, really interviewing many Israelis. I interviewed hundreds of Israelis, and I think something like 150 interviews with average Israelis from every sector of the country.
And of course, you speak Hebrew, so you can interview them in their native language.
I have family in Israel. My mother lives there. My brother lives there. I spent a lot of time in Israel, and I do speak Hebrew fluently. And I used that to really gain access to every sector of Israeli society, including those that don't get a lot of coverage in other books or in media. Really, the Haredi community, the Ultra-Orthodox Jews. Haredi is a kind of better word for ultra-Orthodox. These are 15% of the Jews in Israel. 1 out of 4 of the young people in Israel are Haredi, or from the Haredi communities. They are very influential on the cultural life, on the religious life, of course, but are also increasingly a part of the economic life, a vital part of the economic life there. 20% of the citizens of Israel, are Palestinians who have full rights and opportunities as citizens of the state. And they also never get mentioned in media reports or other books. And I'm really proud to be able to have written about them. I interviewed a Palestinian Israeli citizen lawyer who works for the Ministry of Justice in Jerusalem. He had a lot of really interesting things to say. Yeah. And I also interviewed Bedouins who live in new cities that are being built in the desert. And I also interviewed Palestinians who live in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, or in a kind of situation where they daily have to face off with the Israeli military, what used to be called the occupation, and which today is a term that needs to be fully explored, but is definitely ongoing military confrontation.
All right. Thank you very much for those. The book again is 12 tribes, promise and peril in the new Israel. We've got a caller on the line who's been waiting. Let's hear from Joy in Spokane, Washington. Joy, you're on the line.
Hi. I just had a couple comments about the education issue.
Thank you.
One is they talked about, I think it was Charles who talked about the indoctrination, that oftentimes it's seen that way. And I would say from someone who's from the Democratic, more liberal side, I wouldn't see it in all cases or very often as indoctrination as much as awareness and information. For example, if you're talking about LGBTQ issues, it's not in trying to indoctrinate a lifestyle. It's that there are kids, even in grade school, who would be going home to two moms or two dads. And so it's more of awareness. So other kids know that there are differences among people. My other comment
That's an important point. I don't disagree with that, and I think that's an important point. I'm glad you made it, Joy.
Yeah.
The other thing is that I do get something each day that is ideological, but it's racial injustices over history in America for each date. But I think what I have found really interesting and valuable about that is that you can better understand, I think, where different groups are coming from. For example, if you look at a number of the lynchings that we've had over the years, oftentimes the enforcement bodies are complicit, or they look the other way, or they actively, help during these lynchings. And so that's made me more aware of what might be some of the factors when people will say, well, why don't they just listen to the police and do what they say? And it's,
Well, can I respond to that? Can I respond to that?
Thank you very much.
I think that
Thank you, Joy, for calling in. Hold on.
You're
Thank you,
absolutely
Joy.
right.
Go ahead.
That police, especially in the Jim Crow South, but it was also true in many areas in the North and in the West, were complicit with white racism in the past. I think that the problem is when that view becomes the dominant view of what our country and what its law enforcement and all the rest is. And I think it's a problem when we teach, as I think many African American students are taught, fundamentally that they are victims. And I think that it removes a sense of agency from them, a sense that they can create their own lives. And I think that it depreciates a sense that we made a lot of progress on racial issues, and we made a lot of progress on more fair policing. And I think that we've now gone too far in the opposite direction. That is, we have now made it so difficult, I think, for police to enforce reasonable laws that a lot of areas of our cities, and especially the poorest and most vulnerable areas, now live in peril of predators on the street. I think that's terrible.
Now, Eitan, any common ground on this?
Well, I'm just going to go back to what I said earlier in terms of education, that I think that what is being taught at the grade school level varies greatly from, we were talking about an exclusive private school on one hand, and in my case, what I think of is a very good public school. I think that there's a wide distinction in terms of resources and approach and general capacity to teach kids at different ages. And so I think we just have a long way to go. I'm not as concerned with as Charles is with with people kind of being taught in the wrong attitude as I am with people not getting the basics of what they need in public schools everywhere.
All right.
That's really really where I'm concerned.
Very quickly, let's hear from Hal. He's called in from Redding, California. Hal, you're on. What is your bottom line point?
Be beyond the Beltway here, even over in far northern California. The point that there are no heroes is misstated. I have been a registered nurse for 30 years. I have come home from ICU trauma shifts where I had to throw my blood-soaked tennis shoes into the trash because I could not walk into my home with them. I have tutored young nurses that are now going through one of the greatest crises we've ever seen, where they didn't have treatment modalities.
We got to go. That was Hal from Redding, California, who we thank for calling in, making an important point about heroes among us, the first responders, himself a registered nurse in Northern California for more than 30 years. I'm Chris Roebling. It's Beyond the Beltway, Sunday evening. We'll be back after this.
With instant acceleration, electric cars are more fun to drive and more affordable than ever. Electric cars are here. Plug in to the present.
Sunday evening means Beyond the Beltway, and it's Chris Roebling. Very happy to sit in for my friend Bruce DuMont. Joining me, two other friends, Charles Lipson and Eitan Mikhaili. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you dial in at 1-800-723-8289. Eitan, let's shift. We've been talking about education. Let's talk about violence and policing. Now, this is a very short segment, but we'll have more time after the top of the hour. Can you walk us through your view of what Charles was just referring to, which is the requirement for protection among some of the poorest folks in the country for whom, quote, defunding the police, unquote, removes a last line of protection where they really don't have the resources to fill in any other line of protection for their families, their possessions, their homes, and sadly, they themselves personally?
Let me speak as someone who's covered as a journalist policing in Chicago, which is a city that usually stands and today also stands in about the middle of the road when it comes to most metrics for homicide, for most major crimes in the city. In other words, as Chicago goes, so goes the nation. Homicide has surged in the country. It's surged in Chicago. And also as someone who just wrote a book about Israel, to put things in perspective, the homicide rate in the Chicagoland area, which is roughly the same population as Israel-Palestine, the homicide rate in Chicago is many times the rate of people being killed in Israel-Palestine, even when you take into account wars. Even when you take into account the latest combat that you had in Israel in May, where Hamas was firing rockets at Israel and Israel was using its military to bomb Gaza. Even when you take that into account, the homicide rate in Chicago is many times the rate in Israel-Palestine. Now, look at the rate of homicide on the neighborhood level in Chicago, and you find that the neighborhoods in Chicago where most of the homicides take place, because when I was covering homicide in the 90s and the rate was almost as high, it was spread out throughout the city. I would go to work. This was horrible, but it was true that I would go to work homicide to homicide, right? I would go from the north side to the south side, homicide to homicide. Today, all the homicides are basically taking place in south and west side neighborhoods.
Eitan,
so that's the context.
So my question for you is, poor people with limited resources rely on the police. Defunding the police tends to mean less protection. So do you think there's any chance of common ground, any chance of bridging political divides, say, on the issue of society helping to protect those with the most limited resources?
Well, this is my read, that the phrase defund the police was not one that originated at a community level. It originated with activists. It was popular for a moment because the same people that are committing a lot of crimes spend years in jail, of course, and then come back to the same neighborhoods where they usually committed crimes. And so people in those neighborhoods were seeing, frankly, generations of men coming out of prison into situations where there were no resources for them. And they were thinking that defund the police meant use the money for programs to help these young men. I will argue that what happened instead is the approach ended up being, let's just decide that there are certain things out there that are no longer crimes.
Okay. Charles
and the
Lipson.
result is, yeah.
Charles Lipson.
So the result is that you have a lot of people out there with no resources and no disincentive to commit crime.
So the question is going to become whether or not ordinary people in those communities begin to push back.
They will. I would say the next election, this is my personal opinion, but I think that both the mayor and Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx will be held accountable for this situation. That I feel very confident in making that prediction. Unless things change radically in the next 12 to 14 months.
Well, they'll have to reach into a large bucket of competence because they certainly don't have any.
I guess my question is, do you think that that's a trend beyond the limits of,
Chicago? It's a national trend. I mean, look, the defund initiative, sometimes called reimagining the police, whatever that is, was defeated in Minneapolis. The mayor of Oakland, which is one of the centers for this kind of defunding, has reversed her position, wants to increase funding. There's a recall movement for Chesa Boudin, Chicago's gift to San Francisco, who these are people, by the way, it's not, the police are constrained, and make no mistake, we want honest policing, and police are given a lot of responsibility, and when they use force excessively or wrongly, as happened in the George Floyd case, for example, those people need to be held accountable, and if they use force in a racist manner, they need to be held accountable. But we need extensive and fair policing, and I think that the effort...
Can I make a point, though, Charles?
Yeah, go ahead.
We need something else. We need competent policing. The direction in the last 20 or 30 years since and I've covered this closely, as I said, the direction the last 20 or 30 years has been to use technological solutions for policing. Not accidentally, these contracts with programs that do sound recordings of gunshots or that do all sorts of electronic surveillance. these are contracts that are very attractive and that give the appearance of saving money at the beginning. But really what's happened is the police departments all over the United States have funded these technological solutions and defunded detectives.
And that's it, Eitan. We're going to be back after these words. Chris Roebling for Bruce DuMont on Beyond the Beltway.
Roll over. Chance high five. All right.
When you adopt a shelter pet, you discover all the things that make them unique.
And your mother and... I am totally a hot person. Right, guys? Thanks for being honest.
They're a little bit of a lot of things, but they're all pure love. Adopt pure love at theshelterpetproject.org.
Not wearing a mask in public is like not wearing a seatbelt because no one else is.
Or not wearing a life jacket because it's uncomfortable.
Or not wearing a helmet because it's just one play.
Or not putting me in a car seat because we're only going down the block.
A mask is like anything that keeps us safe. It only works if you wear it.
So wear a mask when you're out in public, because we're all safer and stronger when we go all in, Illinois.